How do you listen to your soul? How can you hear God's invitation to change your mind? Brené Brown writes about the difference between fitting in and belonging. All of us know what it means to fit in, to try to change essential parts of ourselves so that we will be accepted by others. Belonging, though, is a very different experience. It means learning to be present with people without sacrificing who we are. It requires vulnerability. It means taking a risk. And it happens only in those rare places where we can really be who we are without pretending. It is one of the highest ideals of Grace Cathedral. Regardless of where you come from, what you may have done in the past, or whatever you might believe now, we all belong here. Last Sunday, the Hawaiian Voyaging canoe Hokulea arrived at Aquatic Park in San Francisco after a dangerous journey. In the overflowing amphitheater, we saw musicians and dancers. We heard prayers and proclamations from native peoples from across the Pacific. I wish I could express the feeling of joy and celebration that we all shared together. It was a wondrous event. People describe Nainoa Thompson, the president of the Polynesian Voyaging Society, as a native Hawaiian master navigator. But far more importantly, he was one of the most significant storytellers of our time. And on Tuesday night, I think for 3 hours, he had a lot of stories. He told us about the world that he was born into. He told us about 1893, when the United States government illegally overthrew the Hawaiian Kingdom. And that in 1926, Hawaiian culture and language were outlawed. So by the 1970s, there were fewer than 100 people who could speak Hawaiian fluently, and almost all of them were advanced in age. Hawaiians had lost so much: their sovereignty, their land, their language, their religion, their culture, music, art, even sports and pastimes. It no longer felt like they belonged in their own homeland. And then in 1948, the Norwegian writer Thor Heyerdahl published a book called The Kon-Tiki Expedition, by raft across the South Seas. I remember reading it as a child. For many Hawaiians, the book's unspoken thesis was that Pacific Islanders could never have had the skill to build canoes and navigate them through the Pacific Ocean at their will, but instead that they only arrived in Hawaii by luck on giant rafts setting out from South America. And so in the 1970s, a group of Hawaiians sought out the last remaining navigators and relearned the practices of their ancestors. They built the Hokulea, the traveling voyaging canoe. And in 1976, they successfully traveled all the way from the Hawaiian Islands down to Tahiti. And they were utterly surprised when they came into the harbor and there were 17,000 people there to welcome them into Papaete. The mood was ecstatic, and the world began to see how they belonged. But then came the fateful voyage of 1978. Unprotected in a massive storm, stacking waves, massive waves, waves bigger than you could ever imagine, overturned the canoe. One of the hulls, its twin-hulled, filled with water and was sinking. The other was upside down. And the entire crew, 14 of them, were sitting on the hull at midnight in the midst of this massive swells with waves knocking them off every few minutes. And there they were, wondering what was going to happen. And it looked like they had no hope. They were outside the normal shipping lanes, and no one knew what to do. And so the legendary lifeguard, Eddie Aikau, began to paddle his surfboard to go get help, to go try to find some way to rescue them. And Nainoa swam over to him and was the last person to speak to him before he left. Later, the rest of the crew was just miraculously discovered and rescued by helicopter. But Eddie Aikau was never seen again. And back on shore, Nainoa Thompson heard Eddie's mother wailing just about her lost son. And Eddie Aikau was there at the press conference Nainoa was there at the press conference when Eddie Aikau's dad said to all the press, after they'd all been searching for his son for so many days, that they should call off the search because he didn't want anyone else's lives to be endangered. And for a while, Nainoa had an incredible failure of faith, a failure of confidence. And he lost confidence that he could ever do this again. He lost faith in his calling. And then in the most pivotal moment in his life, Nainoa's father came to meet with him. And they talked about values, about supporting the community. And most of all, they talked about the destination. Not just of a single person's voyage, not just of the voyage of Nainoa's own life, but of the entire Hawaiian people. And Nainoa had to ask himself if he was ready to be changed. When the religious authorities fault Jesus for befriending tax collectors and prostitutes, he tells the story of a father who independently talks to his two sons. He says to each of them, "Go into the vineyard and work." And the first son says no, and then changes his mind later and goes. And the second son says yes, but never goes. And the question is, who did the will of his father? And the answer really is that neither of them did the will of his father. What they should have said is, yes, I'm going, and then gone. But that's not neither of them did. But the one who came closest was the one who said no, but actually did the work. That's obvious to us. And for that reason, he says that the sinners and the tax collectors, they're going to go into the kingdom of heaven before the religious leaders. And the important part of this in Greek is the word that means to change one's mind. Many of you have heard the word metanoia. It means to change one's mind. It means to repent. And that is not the word that's used in this case. Instead, the word that's used is metamelomai. That's easy for you to say, right? That old joke. Metamelomai. And what it really means is to change one's cares, to change what you desire, what's important to you. And it also has a kind of connotation of doing so with regret or doing something out of remorse. And Jesus says that's the difference between people who are obvious sinners and people who are religious authorities. That people who are obvious sinners, they know that they've come up short. They know that they need God in a way that someone who may have sailed through life may not understand. Today we're celebrating, and I love this. I mean, I love having all of our animals here with us. Isn't it wonderful to hear their voices and you're also wonderful to be paying such close attention to this as we hear their barks and chirps and everything on the side. But we're doing this because we're celebrating the life of St. Francis, the patron saint of our city, and this window that's above the rose window behind you. That window is the Canticle of the Sun window. It's dedicated to a beautiful poem that's attributed to St. Francis. But St. Francis was definitely one of those people who was a pretty notorious sinner in his own way. His father was tremendously wealthy, and he was kind of known as kind of a playboy. He put on great parties, let's just say it that way. And in his early 20s, he decided to try to be a soldier a couple of times and failed at that. And he got very ill for a while. He was very sick. And after he recovered, he began spending time at the church in San Damiano. And for a while, he would just sit in the ruins of that church and look up at the cross. And one day, he heard a voice. And the voice said, "Go hence now, Francis, and build my church, for it is nearly falling down." And when Francis heard these words, he took them completely literally. Sometimes you all should do that. He went and began rebuilding that church and then rebuilding 2 others in the next couple of years. Francis cared intensely for impoverished people, and he made himself a poor person for their sake. He founded a movement of monks. He wrote songs. He attained notoriety for preaching to birds and also preaching to human beings. And some say that in the 8th century since his death, no one has more closely approximated the ideal that Jesus teaches. The 20th century writer G.K. Chesterton says that one could never anticipate what Francis would do next. I love that. He was erratic. But he also said that once Francis did something, all you could say was, "Ah, that is just like him." Brother Maseo once approached Francis and asked him why the world followed him so ardently when he didn't seem particularly smart, particularly good-looking, or particularly wealthy. And I have a friend of mine who thinks it's because Francis chose a life of intense and prayerful austerity, and that, although that was like many other saints, he also made being a child of God seem like so much fun. He brought joy into everything he did. Francis said so often, "Rejoice always," and he did, both in his words and in his life. The most famous prayer attributed to Francis begins with these words, "O Lord, let me be an instrument of your will." And Francis lived by emptying himself out so that God could continually grow in him. Francis told Maseo that God had chosen him precisely because he was the greatest sinner. He was the biggest screw-up. And that's precisely why God chose him, to remind everyone that all good things come from God. Emptying out his ego, Francis saw a world filled with God. All people, all animals and birds, even the sun, moon, water, and family, all are our family. And when we empty ourselves of ego, nothing lies outside the spiritual life. So today we remember this remarkable figure by blessing our favorite animals. We bless them, and over the years I've blessed dogs and cats and gerbils and hamsters and turtles and geese and lizards, and we had that pig that keeps showing up every so often. And every week, we also bless the animals that live closest to us. I blessed little Poppy, who couldn't be here today because she's so scared of other dogs, but she's been sick lately, and I understand how she communicates to me without words. We'll also pray today for the wild animals around us, the pelicans and coyotes and whales and seals and dolphins, the salmon and hammerhead sharks, the raccoons, the red-tailed hawks, the squirrels, and even the butterflies too. Isn't it wonderful to live in a city dedicated to a person who we remember by being particularly kind to animals, by, in our awkward way, trying to bless them and recognizing all the ways that they are a blessing to us. In our lifetime, an uncountable number of species will be lost forever because of human activity. And I have a dream that one day soon, we will all truly care for the other creatures and learn how to better understand and care for them. Nainoa Thompson, I haven't been able to express what a beautiful figure he is. He's like truly a Francis-like figure in our time. And he teaches that all storms come in pairs. You never get just one storm by itself. There's always two. He says when the storm hits, you need to take your place at the helm and you need to face into it. You have to be humble, pay respect, and stay with it until you make it through. The second storm is the storm that is inside of us. It is the storm of emotions. And in that storm, we are always tempted by hopelessness, but we can also choose the way of faith. With God's grace, we can decide to be courageous. And that is what Nainoa Thompson ultimately did. By the end of the 1960s, after generations of being forced to fit in, a Hawaiian renaissance in politics, art, and culture began to truly unfold. And there are many signs of it, and I don't have the space to go into it here, but Protect Kaho'olawe, Ohana was part of it, many other important movements. But today, I mentioned there are less than 100 fluent speakers of Hawaiian in the 1970s. Today, there are 22,500 fluent speakers of Hawaiian. And you meet them, they are all so much younger than me, so much more energized than me, and so much more hopeful about the future. The Hokulea has been an indispensable part of this extraordinary transformation. And I can imagine in the beginning, Nainoa Thompson, he probably thought he was just building a canoe, right? But really what he was building was a culture. He was building a people. He was building a world where everyone can belong. And the amazing thing is that this has grown into something even more powerful. And today, the Hokulea sails to unify all native peoples and to share a message. The human beings will never thrive unless the oceans are thriving too. How do you listen to your soul? How can you hear God's invitation to change your mind? Nainoa Thompson and St. Francis were open to being changed by God. They learned to be humble. They dared to imagine a future when all species will be valued and preserved. May each of us conquer our ego and become an instrument of God. May we all belong, and may our life be a blessing to the whole family of God's creatures.